ago, where one of the speakers was talking about, the beauty of digitalization and how it has brought us closer, how they now have these events online, whereas they no longer have to spend so much money on events and catering and all of that. And I'm sure we can all relate, right? But then it was this part where she said, well, that is happening. We need to be aware of, what are ethical issues around us meeting in this way digitally, because it's not just as simple as that. And that's why we're here today, to talk about responsible data in monitoring and evaluation, to say, in this big data economy, what is our responsibility? So when we had that conversation last year at gLOCAL 2020, we went away and said, okay, fine, then we will put together a guide. If we were to send out a call and say, come be part of this, let's put together a guide that M&E practitioners can refer to, can all benefit from, would you want to be a part of it? And of course, M&E practitioners said, yes, we would want to be a part of it. So we sent out a call and said, we as CAA are thinking of studying this, informed by gLOCAL 2020, and would you want to be a part of it? And there were a number of people who wanted to be a part of it, and some of those people are the speakers that you're seeing today. So since gLOCAL 2020 up until now, we've been working on this data governance guidance report, which we are very excited about and cannot wait to share it with you. So today's session is really to just tease out what you can expect in that guidance report. So I'm going to introduce my speakers and we're going to go straight into it. Like I said, if you just joined us, we're going to have a really nice conversation. So please, in the chat box, have your comments, have your question, respond, say whatever you want to say. We just love conversation. So let me just first introduce our speakers today. I have with me Desiree Jason, who's the Senior Manager for Policy and Program Evaluation at the National Department of Social Development, South Africa, and Jessica Musila, who's the founder and lead consultant for Shuma Consulting in Kenya, and Jerusha Gavender, who's the Director for Digital Data Solution at Data Innovators South Africa, and Elsa Flank, who is a researcher at the VVOB Rwanda, and Mark Irura, who is a data governance practitioner at Open Institute Kenya, and Brian Chuma, who's a data protection lawyer at Deme Attorneys in Zimbabwe, and Linda Raftree, who is our consultant and a co-founder of Meltech. Amen. Thank you. So I'm going to go straight into it and into the first question, so that for the sake of time, like I said, we only have an hour. So I'm going to ask Brian, the first question will go to you, Brian. Just tell us about data governance. What is data governance?
Thank you very much, Charita. Hi, good morning, everyone, and I hope you can hear me clearly. Yeah? There are no issues with my volume there. Yeah, thank you so much. So just before I discuss the notion of data governance, I just wanted us to be level with the subject matter of the governance that we are talking about, the issue of data itself, that there is data, the high popular notion of data, which is contained in the GDPR, personal data. A data is any piece of information relating to an unidentified or an identifiable natural person. Now, I just wanted, to the extent that we are dealing here, particularly with M&E professionals, to also be awake to the bulk of data that we deal with, the anonymized research data. So there are two components to data here that we are dealing with. There is the data, which is data is highly popularized by the GDPR scheme. There's also data that deal, the kind of data that academics deal with, the anonymized research data, that you cannot identify a particular individuals using that kind of data. So there are those two components that I just wanted you to be awake to. Now, in terms of data governance, really, there are so many definitions and approaches to it, but it all comes down to a set of rules and norms related to why and how data is captured and used, and who holds responsibility for the process and the output, outcomes, or impacts of dealing with that data. It includes policies, It also includes strategies, standards, rights, as well as the accountabilities for the data that is concerned. As monitoring and evaluation professionals, I really want to relate this to the data life cycle. So data governance is the sort of thing that then applies across the whole life cycle, starting, I would want to say starting from data gathering, but perhaps from the conception of the data gathering process itself. Then you go to data gathering, the storage, the processing, the presentation, and how it plays out in the broader community. So it's the application of those rules and names throughout that data process, that data life cycle in our monitoring and evaluation work. So that's basically what I would say about data governance.
Great, thank you, Brian, for that beautiful breakdown. So now that we understand what data governance is, what are some of the trends that are coming up on the continent? Data governance.
I think what we have done as the Africans is to follow the lead of the Europeans, like the rest of the world. Anyway, the Europeans have been pioneers in this field. The advent of the GDPR early on over the years has really set a trend. So in Africa here, we've had the different regional blocks like SADC, ECOWAS, and the East African bloc, encouraging member states to then enact amended versions of the GDPR at national level. So as I speak right now, I think there are about, no, I don't think there are actually, as a matter of fact, 128 countries out of 194 that have adopted the scheme of the GDPR at national level. And this is the trend that we're having in what we're having in Africa here. But beyond the GDPR, there are also other emerging trends that I would like to speak to briefly. If you look at the GDPR, the scheme of the GDPR, it more emphasizes on the notion of personal data. Data as an individual proprietary asset. Now we're having in Africa a new narrative, and I think CLEAR is also part of this narrative here, where there is emphasis beyond the individual aspects of data to the community aspects. So there is a growing trend to view data as a common pool resource. There's this emerging trend to look at data the way that we look at common resources like grazing lands. So data is not just a personal asset. In some instances, data is perfectly a resource that belongs to the community as opposed to an individual. And this kind of thing impacts on how we govern data. There's also another aspect that is also coming up as a result of this new narrative that looks at the community aspects of data. This shift from transparency and privacy to an interest in justice, in data justice, and the broader developmental issues that come out of the community aspects of that data. Closely related to the same shift again, there's also the issue of a shift from the GDPR framework, which emphasizes personal data, to also consider new innovations that look at multi-stakeholder approaches or multi-stakeholder frameworks that emphasize collective rights to data and also data sharing. And the same aspect, and these things are really closely linked. There's also a shift from the raw, pure aspects of data, which are anchored in terms of the GDPR scheme, to also emphasize on metadata, the kind of new assets, the new information, the new resources that come out of information that is gleaned from the raw data. I think I was also going to mention that as M&E professionals, there's also an issue of the locus of data shifting directly from the activities, the decisions by the M&E professionals to the tools and the procedures that they used. So we're having, because of the technology, artificial intelligence, and all that, most of the standards, most of the strategies, most of the policies, they then become encoded in the tools that we use for collecting data, in the tools that we use for processing data, in the tools that we use for presenting data. So we have this shift now in terms of the locus of governance from the M&E professionals themselves to the computer programmers who design the tools that we use. So these are some of the issues that are emerging on the African continent that as M&E professionals, we then have to look at. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. Maybe you, as a lawyer, I can understand with all the terms and everything. So I'm going to bring in Des to come in, maybe to give us more practical examples of what's happening. So Des, in the government context, how have the new laws impacted the work that you do in government? And maybe you can give us some examples of areas where you've seen change.
Okay. Thanks, Talita, and also thanks for us to participate in the gLOCAL Evaluation Week. So I will set the scene in terms of a case study as I work for the National Department of Social Development in South Africa. So governments normally utilize evidence to improve policies, programs, and for decision making. The COVID-19 pandemic has made governments all over the world more aware of the importance of data. South Africa recently introduced a data governance legislation, which is titled Protection of Personal Information, and we normally call it the POPI Act. And the aim of this act is to put in place data privacy and data protection laws, which is mandated to the Office of the Information Regulator, and it's seated in the Department of Justice. The purpose of the Act is to protect personal information throughout the data lifecycle, which I will also make reference to later. How data is collected, how data is processed, stored, and shared. Government implemented the first large-scale digital social security measure to poor and vulnerable households to lessen the economic and social impact of the lockdown, during the lockdown, to prevent families of hunger and other aspects that will affect their well-being. The special 350 COVID social relief of distress grant targeted persons between the ages of 18 to 59 years. And as I said, it aimed to prevent hunger mainly and to ensure that there is income support into households. So what we wanted to do to have empirical evidence in terms of what was the impact and how do we also improve the implementation of the grant and how it can also be information when government designs the basic income grant. So we conducted an empirical study, and during the designing and planning phase of the study, we had to apply for consent to the information regulator. And this we have never ever done before as a country. So we had to apply to the regulator so that we could utilize the cell phone data of beneficiaries to reach them, to interview some of the beneficiaries then was receiving the COVID grant. So the laws and the regulations clearly stipulated that we will not utilize their personal information like their names, surnames, their ID numbers, and addresses. So there was also the aspect of them being anonymous so that we couldn't identify the beneficiary with their cell phone numbers by name. We signed a data processing agreement with the service provider who was conducting the study that the data will only be utilized for the purposes of the study, and the data will then be deleted, destroyed on completion of the study. What were the things that we realized and what were the game changers for us as a country? We have never asked permission before to utilize beneficiaries' personal information for empirical studies. Writing the letter and asking the information regulator, we had to adhere to all the aspects of the POPI Act in terms of protecting the personal information of the beneficiaries, which was part of the administrative data system that we had. We also had to adapt our standard operating procedures to ensure effective data governance related to data privacy, data protection during the entire M&E value chain. And we also had to include aspects of change management into this. Okay, thanks, Talita.
Thank you so much. It really sounds like there's a lot that you're doing there in order to comply. And you and Brian both kept referring to the data lifecycle, and I see we have that up now. Maybe you can tell us, what is this? What's the relationship? What is the data lifecycle, and what's the relationship between it and the monitoring and evaluation cycle? I know the work that we've been doing has been focusing to the framework of the data lifecycle. So maybe you can explain that to us.
Okay, thanks, Talita. So with the monitoring and the evaluation life cycle, there is 6 steps. On the data life cycle, there is 7 steps, but there's a very close relationship between the two. So with the designing and planning phase, it was about creating the basis for the integration of the data protection into our program, that what data was needed, how it will be collected, by who it will be collected, when it will be collected, and how often it will be collected. So the focus on planning and budgeting for the management of data, the roles and responsibilities, as well as identifying the laws which govern your data collection and obtaining consent, which we did from the information regulator, and putting in place data sharing and processing agreements. And most of this that I have outlined now, we applied it when we did the case study, which I presented on how we implemented and did empirical work around the 350 grant. Okay, thanks, Talita.
Thank you so much, Des. Let me bring Mark in to take us through the second stage. You spoke about the design and planning stage. Mark, to take us through the collection and acquiring data stage. Mark, how is data collection changing in view of making it sustainable?
Thanks, Talitha. So to take a step back, a couple of things are changing in terms of the data that is required to influence decision making to support sustainable development. Technologies have changed. Some of us were in campus before Facebook, before social media. Now it's there. So technologies have sprung up. There's AI, there's artificial intelligence, and so we have a data revolution happening, and it recognizes that the problems that we try to solve are very complex. The data sources are multiple, and we can no longer just rely on official statistics or data that is coming from the National Statistical Office to monitor development, to monitor progress. So there has been a shift even in the principles of statistics and gathering, principles of gathering statistics, to acknowledge that there are alternative sources that can be used to report on the sustainable development goals. Though the UN system recognizes the national statistical offices as the ones holding, who are recognized to kind of report. So there is a shift there to first acknowledge the data revolution, to acknowledge that data might not just emanate from official sources as we know them. And this might be, government offices, departments, ministries, agencies, but data could come from other sources. It could come from Earth observation data. It could come from telcos data. It could come from citizens because it's more regular, it is accurate, maybe it's cheaper to collect. And this information kind of complements the official statistical systems. It complements. And so as we talk about this, then we ask ourselves, like, your question, like, how is it changing? Number one is, this new, or let me call them alternate sources, they are feeding into into official or complementing official reports. You know, a sentiment analysis, for example, is feeding in there somewhere. Then additionally, something that is emerging, but it is not new, is the use of sensors, like the Internet of Things, where sensors are used to share information, whether it's in agriculture or healthcare or in manufacturing. And it is also being harnessed to kind of share or contribute information that, you know, is more sustainable. It's coming from machines, and sensors are getting cheaper and cheaper. But also therein lies, you know, dilemmas that are coming up, like the questions that are arising around artificial intelligence and the ethical use of AI, that AI can be biased, that sensors, you know, can you blame a sensor when things go wrong? Like, who do you prosecute? Who is culpable when things go wrong? So, so those are some of the changes that are happening. I think in terms of sustainability, then all these other sources are being leveraged as well to inform policy, to inform economics, to inform even politics, like how we politic, but, you know, with a broader goal of a sustainable development.
Okay,
Thanks,
I like the
Talita.
fact
Back
that
to you.
yeah, I like the fact that you touched on the Internet of Things and AI and all those things. And I'm just thinking, like, as M&E practitioners, you know, sometimes we might think that we need to only be looking at just concerned, you know, issues of concern. Is that all there is to it, or is there more as M&E practitioners that we should be focusing on when we talk about being responsible with data?
Yeah, so there's the ethical part of it, and you know, as researchers, you know, informed consent is normally part of the package. And even when you do research methods, you know, there is the issue of power between the researcher and those who are researched. Like when you're speaking to children, that's basic, you know, in terms of the questions you can ask, and then being comfortable enough to be able to answer questions. The other thing that is important is to kind of, and it touches again a little bit on the governance issue, which Brian raised, because he was talking about the GDPR. But broadly, coming back to that particular issue is informed consent, just being able to say, yes, I will participate, or I will not participate? Or is informed consent actually coming back and saying, you know, this is how I'll collect your data, this is how I'll use it, this is how I'll process it, and you know, express that in a simpler way that is not full of jargon and legal terms, that the people who participate understand, you know. So are we looking at participants, you know, the power dynamics between a researcher and the participants, or a community, or we are looking at government and citizens? And so the data governance comes into play, and, you know, frameworks like data protection come into play, where we are saying, yes, you know, the aspect of the individual and the community and the protection of their data and data as an asset, and then also being open enough and thinking about consent, not just in terms of yes or no, I'm participating or I'm not, but also like being transparent enough to say how I'll use this data, who will use it, how long will I use it, and do I even come back to you and say, we did this study, you participated, here are the findings. So I think those are some of the key important things to consider, you know, as the issue of consent emerges.
Okay, great. Quick one. What are some of the emerging data sources that we cannot ignore?
Yeah, so I mentioned some of them a little bit earlier. So we have alternative data sources that are coming up. So we have Earth observation data, We have telcos data that is being used to like monitor sustainable development. We have, sentiment analysis from social media or apps, wearable technology. We have a IoT, the Internet of Things, as I've mentioned, and sensors. I also think with this comes the need to build capacities of individuals like Mark. Can I be data literate? Then communities, do they understand what to agitate for when they are looking at data? Can they see this is a budget statement and this is what it means for us? This is where the money went. Because those skills are needed. We might talk about data, but the capacities do not exist. And then just the basic, I'm modernizing, I'm using technology. And then also the partnerships to ensure that sustainably we can manage a data ecosystem and infrastructure. So I've answered another question there, but I'm also trying to say like this alternative data sources, including data generated by citizens, needs to be managed in a new way, and a new set of skills and capacities need to be built, and we need to be aware of them as practitioners. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mark. Let's move over to Linda. Linda, let's talk about the third stage, data transmission and storage. What is data transmission and storage? Maybe take us, before you get there, just a little bit of, from where we went from the first, second stage to there, and what is it?
Thanks, Talitha, and morning or good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So when we talk about data transmission and storage, if you think you've planned your whole exercise out, you've collected your data, normally you're going to transmit it somewhere so that it could be processed or analyzed, and you're going to have to store the data somewhere. So when we think about data transmission and storage in the context of responsible data management, we're really thinking a lot about data security in these phases. So transmission is when you, for example, send data from a device to the cloud. It could be you're collecting survey data on a mobile device and you're sending it to the cloud, you're transmitting it. It could be that you're emailing a spreadsheet to someone who's going to do that analysis. And that's really what we're talking about with transmission, sending data from one organization to another, moving data within your team. That's all data transmission when you're moving data. And then data storage is where you're holding it afterwards. You might be holding data on a mobile device. You might be holding it on your internal server. It might be on your laptop, or it might be in the cloud on like an Amazon server or something like that. So we really want to think about data protection in these phases of transmission and storage.
Okay, so I'm thinking security could be such an issue right now at this stage, right? So what are ways to protect data at this stage of the life cycle?
Sure. So when we're transmitting data, some of the really important things to think about are not using open Wi-Fi networks. So that's really a great place for somebody to hack or to steal your data. If you're using a Wi-Fi network at an internet cafe, if you're in a hotel lobby using an open Wi-Fi network, that's a really good place for someone to hack into your system because those systems generally aren't secure. It's really easy for those to be intercepted. Another important thing to think about is if you can use encryption when you're transmitting data, or if you can use passwords if you're sending data, a data set or an Excel spreadsheet, there are ways that you can use your email server to put a password, a strong password on the data, so only the person that's receiving the data can open it, or encrypting your entire device. There are lots of YouTube videos that can show you how to use encryption better. So I would recommend kind of doing some searches around there and learning about that. And then when you're, another really good way to protect your data during transmission, if you're working at an institution that uses something like Microsoft SharePoint or Microsoft 365 Office, it's much better to use the Office storage that comes with the Microsoft Office, because then you're not emailing data back and forth. You're just kind of uploading it to a shared place where other people can access it, or using Dropbox, using box.net, using some of these file sharing services. But it's really good to check the terms and conditions and make sure that they're secure, before you just use a random file sharing service, because the more secure ones tend to be SharePoint, Box.net, and Dropbox. Then when it comes to data storing, thinking about the data that you have in your system, it's really important to, we haven't talked a lot about it, but there's this idea of data minimization. So that means really collecting the least amount of data that you can, not collecting tons and tons of data and keeping all this data on your drive. It's really good to go through periodically and remove data that's no longer necessary. That's one way of keeping data secure when you're storing it. The cloud tends to be quite secure. So you might want to think about using cloud storage instead of keeping everything directly on your laptop. Laptops get stolen, flash drives get stolen, they get viruses. So really storing things in the cloud tends to be more secure. Using really good passwords, not sharing your passwords, keeping your passwords secure. Then there's something called two-factor authentication, where you might log into something and then you get a message on your phone that gives you a second code. That's also a really good way to keep your data stored in a more secure way. And then the last thing I'll mention is setting up access levels. So if you are using a shared drive, if you're using a shared Google Drive or you're using a shared SharePoint drive, you shouldn't allow every single person on your team, every single person in the organization to access data if you're collecting personal and sensitive data. So you want to restrict access to your data so that only those who absolutely need to access it can access it, and that helps also keep it more secure. So I'll end on that note and pass off to I think it's Ilse on the next stage, but over to you, Talitha.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was quite a lot and simplified. So Elsa, take us through the data cleaning and analysis stage. What are the minimum considerations for responsible data cleaning?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question, Talitha. So yeah, I mean, cleaning and analysis, you can see it as two separate phases. So I'll just focus on cleaning for now. And I think in terms of cleaning, one of the most important things is to have a very clear data cleaning plan, to agree on that from the start with the team members. And in that data cleaning plan, there are some very essential things I think to add. And one of them is, for instance, an agreement about like backups and file naming, and relating also to what Linda said, like where you're going to store things. But another thing is, of course, anonymizing data. How are we going to deal with that? To what level are we going to anonymize? I always find it very useful to develop a variable logbook, keeping track of what kind of changes we made to different variables and why we made those changes. Then, of course, a very essential part before you start your analysis, and in order to not draw any wrong conclusions, is to run some very descriptive analyses of your data, just to understand what's happening. Are there any duplicates? Is anything wrong with my data? Just to make sure you're not working with a data set that has a lot of errors. And then very important is to work with software, so really dedicated statistical software where you can really also use scripts and syntaxes to keep track of what you're doing. And then lastly, I think this is less of an issue when you're working with data collection software, but when you're still working with paper-based surveys, missing data could be a big problem. So you need to think about what you're going to do with that missing data and how you're going to deal with it. Yeah, I think those are the most essential things. Like, I could talk about this for another hour, but just trying to tease out the most relevant things. Okay,
so then how would I know that I'm using the right analysis method? How do I go about that?
Yeah, so analysis is of course another part of it. First you do the cleaning, then you do the analysis. Of course, before you do all of that, you have the plan for both. And the plan is important. So it's important to know what kind of data do I have and what do I want to do with that data? So that's a very, very first important question to ask yourself. Do you want to describe? Then maybe a frequency table is enough. But if I want to look for a relationship, do I need to do something more advanced, like inferential statistics, like linear regression, where I could maybe also account for some difficulties with my data sets, or do I want to do something quite simple like a correlation? So that's all of it depends on what you want to do and what your data looks like. And for qualitative data, of course, we shouldn't forget about that as well. It's definitely very important to be responsible with qualitative data. And in terms of the methods used that you can use there, I think it depends very much on whether you are generating theory or whether you're confirming theory. And there are different methods out there that you could use. So I think that's, again, a summary. Much more of this is of course in the guidance. So when that comes out, I do definitely encourage everyone to read that section as well.
Great, thanks, Elsa. As summary in that, so I'm going to encourage my colleagues, if there's anybody who has a question around what Elsa was talking about around the data cleaning and analysis, please feel free to send your comment in the chat box and she will respond to them. Let's move on to Jessica. Jessica, let's talk about open data and data sharing. This is the fifth stage of our data lifecycle. What is open data and its key aspects that we should know about?
Okay, thank you, Talita. Can you hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Okay, I beg to stay off the video because my bandwidth is low. Open data is data that can be freely used, reused, and distributed by anyone, subject to only to attribute and share, commonally and tell people, give attribution that where you sourced it from. And most of this has been promoted actually by the Open Government Partnership Movement and something also called the Open Data Partnership. And the emergence of the access to information laws has actually also provided a push for generation of this data. These are data sets that should be, that people can use, as researchers can use to build on, upon, to, be able to do analysis for the other data sets. For example, in education, in holding leaders to account, in parliamentary monitoring, many times you find people are struggling to know what kind of data sets they can use. But if they actually start looking what in their purview of this person to make a decision about, then they can easily get, let's say, data about health or data about schools and put it up on a platform which is called the Open Data Store. A few governments embraced it when it came onto the market. As Morocco and Kenya were among the early ones. But since then, it seems that there still remains a reluctance within government to use it because also the data sharing systems within different governments is not still very clear. And you find the mandate holders many times at the statistical offices and the duty bearers who are, the administrative or sector specialist offices many times feel it's not their place to be sharing this data even across agencies of the same ministry. So that it remains a challenge. But one of the key aspects that we need to remember is that it has to be available, easily accessible as the whole data set. You can't remove just aspects of it. You need to make it all accessible and in machine readable formats. It has to be accessible for reuse and redistribution without cost, really. And if there's any cost, it should be only purely for moving it from one document to another or machine to another, rather than it actually being a case where you have to charge somebody to use your data. And then universal participation is ensured. Everyone must be able to use it, reuse it, and distribute it with no discrimination. And against any persons or groups. And this data is interoperable, as in it can be layered. You can take this data as a basis, for your baseline, and then start building on top of it with other data sets that they can interact freely. But it's interesting to see what's the case uses have been. I know it's become very essential to activism in our continent, and the young people would like to take this data and use it to ask questions of duty bearers. And that's how I've seen it largely used. And in the education sector, when you want to see is the data that the school system is releasing, the official school system releasing, actually matching up with the lived experience of the citizens, maybe the mothers the parents? Are our students really learning? Those are some of the projects that I have seen open data really being used and making a difference in Kenya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I love that you summed up that question, because I was going to ask you about the challenges, but you went right ahead of me. So awesome. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to move over to Jerusha, who will tell us about data visualization and communication. And maybe you can just start by telling us what is responsible data communication.
Thanks, Talita. So when we talk about data communication, firstly, this really refers to how we package data in order to reach our intended audience. This could be either at the end of whatever your data kind of exercise has been. So for example, an evaluation report, but it also could be intermittent data sharing. And when we think about responsible data communication, this is really like at minimum ensuring that we are truthful in our data communication, but also thinking about what kind of mechanisms are in place to make sure that our data communication is accessible to the audience or the stakeholders that the data should reach, as well as it does not do harm to the individuals that have been the data providers, and our means of data communication doesn't restrict how it can be used in an appropriate manner. And the other things from a practical side, when we talk about responsible data communication, it really refers to us being intentional at every point of the packaging exercise, right from really defining who our audience is, but understanding their context as well, in terms of how this packaging or how this data would reach them, but then also using that to inform the choices that we make around what that package looks like, from the visual elements to the auditory elements, the format itself, and lastly, things around the medium, like through what medium, whether it be social media, email, or print, makes the most sense for that individual or individuals.
Awesome. So when we talk about the packaging, right, for those different stakeholders, why is understanding the level of data literacy of those different audience important?
Yes, that's an important question, because I think often when we talk about data visualization, like know your audience is a key thing that we usually start off with. But actually knowing your audience is not just about knowing who they are, but understanding their data literacy levels are critical, because I may know my audience is a policymaker, but a policymaker in one department may be different in another department. And really understanding the level of data literacy is around being clear on what is that individual or that team or that group's ability to read the data, ability to work with the data, analyze it, or use it to argue about what it means. And once you understand this is usually quite varied, that then informs you actually what's the level of complexity or the design that I need to take into account to meet that individual's data literacy, because without taking that into account, it's not necessarily responsible or accessible to the individual.
Thank you so much, Jerusha. I'm going to allow you to take us through the data retention, maintenance, and destruction stage. This is the last stage of the data lifecycle, and maybe you can tell us why that's the last stage and what do we mean by it?
Okay, great. So interestingly, the retention and destruction and maintenance or management of the data, it's the last stage, but it's something that you must think about in the beginning, actually. So it's not necessarily, because it's placed at the end, necessarily an afterthought or a last thought, but like Brian mentioned, it's actually part of the overall data governance thinking and plan. And when we talk about retention and management and the destruction of data, it's basically putting in place considerations for managing personal or sensitive data from the birth of it. So once, when it's actually created or generated, to the death of the data, like what happens once it's been aggregated, consolidated, and reported. And the reason that this is quite important and we need these measures is because we need to be thinking about how do we reduce or minimize the risk of data misuse. So once I've used it for its intended purposes, how have I ensured that I've minimized data and ensure things like it's been anonymized, we've done the periodic aggregation, and we've kind of stated at what point is this data no longer used and can be destroyed.
Great. And what are key considerations then at this stage?
So at this point, the first key consideration to make around planning for, when or how do I retain the data and go through destruction of the data is that firstly, you consider like what are the existing like national kind of policies or standards related to this, because essentially if those exist within your country, this process needs to be aligned to that. So for example, there's referred to papaya. So in South Africa, we'll need to be aligned with how are we aggregating or storing information at the end that's aligned to this act. If that does not exist, I think it's also important to think about how, what are other global policies or frameworks that can guide you on this. So the EU General Data Protection and Regulation guidelines provide some insights on how to deal with this. Then once you've considered the high level, what are the parameters for this? It's then looking at it from also what are the agreements made with other stakeholders. So was there agreement what is the period on data storage, for example, with the funder of the research or the evaluation? What was the agreement made with the providers of the data as well, and ensuring that you've kind of managed and aligned with that. And then lastly, it's also looking at it from a practical side, considering, what type of data do you have and how do you intend to use it to inform, the timeline and the retention of that data. So for example, if you are conducting a longitudinal study, it makes sense to consider the retention for the period that covers that study, as well as beyond that, rather than coming up with a plan that it requires destruction of the data at a certain period, but we know there's a follow-on study coming up. So those are some of the key kind of practical, but also higher level considerations to take into account with data retention and destruction.
Thank you so much, Jerusha. I'm going to be fair and find out if there are any questions from the floor. So if there's anybody with a question, please feel free to unmute yourself, ask your question, so that we can answer that before we go into the poll. Okay, so I'll take it that there's no question. If there is, you can still type it into the chat box. I'm going to ask Vanilla if you can please put up the poll. We just want to find out from what we have discussed today, which areas have been a challenge for you, what do you recognize as a challenge from the presentations that we just got from the panel. So the poll is up. If you can just vote your top 3 challenges. Interesting, as the results are trickling in, data visualization and communication looks to be the one leading. Data retention. Data cleaning and analysis, also a challenge. Design and planning, it looks like we all doing great when it comes to design and planning. So we all doing great in the beginning of the data life cycle. But when we then move over to data cleaning and analysis, that's when we experience most challenges. Okay, I think we've done voting. So data cleaning and analysis looks to be a challenge. That's a tie with data visualization and communication. That's very interesting. I wouldn't have thought that. Maybe I'm speaking as a communications person myself, but okay. Then Data retention and maintenance and destruction, also a challenge. But the least challenge is design and planning, collecting and acquiring data, and then data transmission and storage also seems to be doing fine. So the challenge really starts at data cleaning and analysis, going down to data retention, maintenance, and destruction. Thank you so much for participating in that poll. I hope you've learned the importance of responsible data in all those different stages. And we have 4 more minutes. So I'm gonna still ask you, if you have questions, please go ahead and ask the questions. We have the panel, like we mentioned, we've been working on this data governance report since the last local, and it's currently being edited. So we look forward to sharing it with you, and we will share it with each and every one of you on the call. We'll also share it with those who participated in our last local. So if you have any last comment, question, please feel free.
Will there be a version in French for the Francophones?
We can organize that for you probably. We'll have to look into it. Unfortunately, we had only looked into the English version, but that's something that we can look into.
I'm sure that Clear Francophone Africa would be happy to collaborate.
Absolutely, yeah. We will partner with them on that.
Talita, there was a question earlier on from Candice asking about the alternative sources of data. It sounds exciting, but what are the risks in terms of what governance mechanisms are needed for instance, quality assurance, validation, etc. So that was one of the questions that was put up.
Okay, thank you, Vanilla, for that. I'm wondering if Brian, would you, or Mark, would you like to take that question?
And maybe you can repeat the question kindly.
Okay, the question says, alternative sources of data is exciting, but what are the risks of this? So what governance mechanisms are needed for this? And then, for instance, quality assurance, validation, and so forth.
Yeah, so some of the risks mostly have to do with bias, especially when machines are making decisions. And I'm specifically now talking about, data collected from sensors or IoT, or data collected, or big data generally, like information that has been collected on one segment, who are the majority, and then decisions or tech is built on top of that. And I think you've seen, for example, a lot of backlash coming through on language translators and so forth, which don't take care of gender, for example. So one of the thing that arises there is the data representative enough, so that if a machine will work on the basis of the data points, then it is not excluding people. And especially if this is going to inform a policy. So bias is one. I think the other thing as well is responsibility or culpability. Like at the end of the day, if there is an issue that arises from data that has been collected and used for a particular purpose, can you blame the computer? Can you blame the machine? Often not. And so this is the other risk to kind of like look out for. And obviously in the field of intellectual property rights and artificial intelligence, and processing and churning out big data, these are some of the concerns that are coming up, that are there's research going on into it. I think it's been there for critical, they're called critical safety systems, like aircraft, for example. When things fail, what happens. Is it a mechanical issue, or you blame the software developer who developed the software? But that is like a body of research is going on right now, because like AI is being applied to policy. I think representativeness, you know, that growing body of research. I think the other thing that is critical is to look at, yeah, you know, Brian talked about it a little bit. Personal information, personal identifiable information. So it can be de-anonymized using technology. I think that is another area of concern. Maybe, you know, understanding that is a problem. Maybe it doesn't just offer a solution now, but also like can there be protocols around? And I think Jerusha talked a lot about it, like now decommissioning or stopping to use the information, because the data is collected for a specific purpose. So as long as it's there, it can be de-anonymized. And you know, the people from the constituency of data for development are saying, for us to make better decisions, it has to be granular. But at the same time, you know, there is these concerns about, you know, authoritarian regimes coming into place and using this information to target people because of their religious or other beliefs. So that balance of being responsible enough to say, maybe we will not use this data after a particular period, or put in place laws that prevent people from collecting certain kinds of information which they do not need for their research or decision making. But then also, even if data can be de-anonymized, then there are, you know, legal mechanisms to protect participants or subjects or citizens from this particular vice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I see one of our colleagues, Rachel, is on the line, and I wonder if she has any final comments. Sorry, Rachel, to put you on the spot, but in case you do, just that I should give you a moment. Rachel?
Yes, Talita. Did you want me to comment on the last speaker?
Yeah, sure, if you would like.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's on my side, but I can't hear.
I can't hear either.
I think what I can say is that in as much as in use of personally identifiable, we need to highlight a way in which we can use non-granular data, aggregated data, without necessarily looking at it from a granular perspective, that can still generate insights that can inform data for development outcomes. And I believe that you know, once anonymized and it is aggregated, you're not looking at individual level data. There are opportunities there to preserve the privacy and to uphold ethics and confidentiality of data subjects. Having said that, obviously, authoritarian regimes are always going to be there. And I mean, if there is a need for them to actually leverage use of data for non-human rights approaches or for surveillance of their citizens, in some ways it goes beyond the tenets of what we can actually do within data for development initiatives. So I just wanted to also share of those opportunities where we can still leverage data in safe and responsible ways in reaching development outcomes, but to also mention the nuance that exists in that, you know, the political landscape of governments that might want to surveil their citizens will still remain whether we use such data in safe and responsible ways or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you to all the participants, all the everybody who's here, thank you very much. And sorry, Tandega, that the session was short. We thought you would appreciate it short, but next time we will keep it longer. Thank you so much. And we hope that you have a wonderful day and the rest of Local Evaluation Week. And we will, of course, share this recording with you. So have a good day.